welcome to episode 4 of the Stoner Story Witch podcast. My name is Kristyn. It is a pleasure to have you with us today, with me, let's be honest. All right, so just a summary. We are in the middle section of this season, the first kind of third. The first 2 episodes, I dove into secure attachment and contact nutrition. These middle two episodes, episode 3 and this episode, is kind of diving into more of like a character analysis. In the last episode, I looked at the March sisters, their needs, wants, thresholds, the big lies that they contend with. And in this episode, I'm going to take a little bit of a moment to have a little bit of a nuanced conversation about what I'm calling the wealth wound and how it is portrayed in this movie. I am looking at Sally, Laurie, Mr. Laurence, and Aunt March specifically. And I want to just say that this is a nuanced conversation. Here on the Stoner Story Witch podcast, I subscribe to that systems of oppression are the villain, people aren't the villain. We offer care and softness to individuals, and yet we're hard on these systems. That can be really hard to have that conversation when there are people with loads of privilege doing loads of harm and kind of an unwillingness or inability to even see their privilege. It can lead to definite frustration and anger and calls of eat the rich, which justifiable, very much justifiable. And like, I guess I want to just make sure that if the idea of extending compassion to rich people in capitalism, or extending compassion to men in patriarchal systems, or white people in systems of white supremacy, if that is just like, if you are like feeling already irritated at just the thought that I am going to spend an episode trying to have a nuanced conversation about like men are hurt in patriarchy and rich people are hurt in capitalism, like, then like I really invite you to take care of yourself, and that might mean you don't listen to this episode, and I want to honor that and make space for that, because yeah. And I also want to be very clear that although men are harmed in the patriarchy, which I alluded to in episode 1, secure attachment and the male gaze, this moment when the men are on the outside looking in longfully at the connection that the March women all have, that patriarchy conditions men to be unable, unwilling to be their authentic selves, be emotionally vulnerable, develop skills of emotional resonance. And that is harmful. It is dehumanizing, certainly. And by no means would I ever say that men have it worse than women. And of course, we look at intersectionality, and it of course, like, you know, women of color or trans women of color are going to be experiencing all of those, all of those systems of oppression more so than just any one intersectionality. So I hope that I'm not a teacher of these things. I can put a link into the show notes for anybody who might be interested in kind of, I'm assuming that you have a level of awareness of intersectionality and privilege. And again, just tread lightly on this episode, I guess, one way or the other. And I do think it is important and I will get into it in this episode, to really point out where people in power positions within these systems of domination are robbed of their humanity, are severed from the collective. So that is my hope, to have that conversation today. I want to take a moment here at the relative beginning of the episode to just locate myself a little bit in where I am, where I am as I'm recording and editing this podcast. So I am very grateful to be here on Chorotega lands, colonially known as Costa Rica. I grew up on the Dakota lands, the Wapakudi Dakota lands in Minnesota. I have never lived on my own ancestral lands. I am a third and fifth generation settler colonizer of kind of Norway and Czech Republic on my dad's side. And then on my mom's side, my family seems to be among some of the original colonizers of Turtle Island, Canada and the United States. But that side of the family is like English and England and Wales, and so very white European. And it has been several generations since I have lived on the land that held my ancestors, my ancestral or indigenous ways of knowing and relating to the land and who I am on it, a part of it. And I am sitting in the question of, what does it take for me to be here in a good way on whatever land I am? If I acknowledge whose land I'm on, what do I know about them? What are my positionalities, my responsibilities? What are my values? How can I be in alignment with my values? Holding who I am and where I am in this moment. And if you've been listening to this podcast, it will probably not be a surprise when I say that this is a practice. This land acknowledgement is a profound political practice that I have had the honor of participating in and receiving it on the Numinous Network with Carmen Spaniola. I've been in a practice of acknowledging whose land I'm on and what positionality do I hold here? How do I be here in a good way? That has been a guiding light that I just want to name, that is, I think, also behind this episode specifically, when I'm asking us, and by us, I mean myself. But if you're listening, feel free to ask along. I am asking myself in this episode, where do I realistically stand when I locate myself in this story? So I'm feeling kind of a buzziness in my face, a need for a stretch, and to have a sip of water. And let's dig in. So in this episode, I'm going to highlight 4 flavors of a wealth wound. The first being demonstrated by Sally, which is an inability to be able to form intimacy within friendships. And then I will move to Laurie, where I will look at how his access to excessive material resources creates a stagnation of his creative process. Then I'll move to Mr. Laurence, where I'll talk about how the wealth wound can sometimes manifest in like the desire to want to connect to your shared humanity with your community can create almost a further distancing in terms of kind of charity versus relationality. And then I will get to Aunt March and how wealth can actually sever us from our own values. So we're operating on the premise that when you are gaining power in systems of domination, there is a level of needing to sever yourself from some aspect of your true self or your belonging in the greater community. That wealth can change your brain, can change your attachment, can change. There's like something that actually happens in a body over time in a familial line or even over a lifetime. So with all of that, let's begin. When we look at Sally, we know that Sally is a friend of Meg's that has always been at a socioeconomic status that has been higher than Meg's. We also know that Meg, as the oldest sister, remembers a time when they had more resources. We see that incident in the dress shop that I've already covered in previous episodes. But I do just want to circle back to that to say that Sally is missing out on a really great relationship with Meg by not being more attuned to her financial reality in that dress shop. I relate to Sally and am sitting in the question of what would transparency look like, and an acknowledgement that I may have more access to material resources or some level of privilege. It could be anything. I mean, this episode is about the wealth wound. I'm recording a hobby podcast, so let's be very clear that I'm speaking for myself when I'm like identifying and diving into the wealth wound. But what does it look like for me to acknowledge that I might have an excess of time, material resources? What privileges do I hold within my friendships? As I began recording this podcast, we had just had some friends that had been living with us for a couple months as they were in kind of a pickle when it came to their housing situation. And so they stayed with us for a few months, and there was a deep practice for me of inviting and welcoming my friends to live with my family, and not because I want the rent money, like capitalism would condition me to, like, oh, we can make some extra money. What a great opportunity to make some money. But acknowledging that I have excess space in my home that I can offer to people in my community who have a need for housing. And that if I'm thinking, what does it take to be here in a good way? Well, if there's somebody in my community that has a need and I have the capacity or the privilege to offer to fulfill that need, why wouldn't I? And that isn't the type of relationality that we see from Sally. And we know Meg to be an amazing character, a very loving and devoted and loyal daughter, sister. And there is a level of misattunement. We could go back to episode 2, which is when I first talked about the Sally Meg situation. But I really want to bring home that, like, it makes me curious who is there for Sally when she's having a hard time. Is she able to ask for her needs to be met by people in her life? Is she even aware of the emotional needs that she might have? Because, and I'll get to this in the Hadestown episode next, but the ways that capitalism teaches us that we can meet our needs through money. Money will buy us happiness, security, attachment. And we see that evidenced with Sally. So moving on to Laurie. Laurie is an orphan. We know that his dad ran away from his grandfather, married his mother, who was an Italian musician. Both of them ended up dying, and he now lives with his grandfather. And let's just take a little beat to just fucking sit with this for just a second. That Laurie has this expectation of righting the wrongs of his father in the eyes of his grandfather. And meanwhile, he has a desire to pursue the very same pursuits as his mother. In the book, he mentions that he wanted to write operas and be a famous composer. And again, I think it's mostly in the book, but we know that like the reason that his dad ran away was that his grandfather didn't approve. And instead, Laurie is now resentfully dragging his feet at taking over his grandfather's business. And he's also not actually doing what he desires. He's wasting his time in Amy's eyes. And Amy is just so jealous of all the resources and talent that he has the on paper, he can do whatever it is that he likes, but he's not doing anything at all. And like Amy is just like exasperated. Like, I don't understand. You are wasting your life. And that there's a pressure. There is in his way, in his family, there is this pressure to I'm sure he does love his grandfather. And what? We could take an entire episode to try to just unpack the abandonment wounds and attachment issues of Laurie. I know I addressed that a little bit. The kind of like the pursuit of Joe that then kind of, he landed in some security then with Amy. I think I mentioned that in episode 1. Laurie is feeling this push-pull of it's the same, does he want to be loved or does he want to love? He wants to love the person he's going to be with, what he wants to do with his time. We don't really know what he ends up doing. Does he give himself permission to like pursue his creative pursuits, or does he? We actually don't know, but maybe we assume that there's a level of integration in order for Amy to like marry him. I'm not sure, but just want to highlight that what I see and what I relate to, especially being a person who has really been wanting to pursue a creative journey, which I guess is, it's Stoner Story Witch, baby. it's the question, it's the step 1, step 2, step 3. It's the journey of it all. And it's been 3 years of thinking and ruminating and doubt. And I have had the thoughts myself. Perhaps people who know me have wondered, what is she up to? What's she fucking doing? She's dawdling. She's wasting her time. Whether other people have thought that or not, I really am trying to just not give a shit anymore. I will say for myself, those have been voices that have been going on in my head. Like, what am I doing? Like, I got to do something. And what would people think? What would people in my own family, right? There's the wealth that I have received through tragedy as well as through inheritance. So the people who were impacted in that tragedy, or the people who left that money for me via inheritance, there is a sense that there is like an energy of like, I got to do right by them. I better make them proud. It's that I want to be loved, even if those people aren't still here. They've moved on. They've passed into the next realm. But there's still this fear. There is a lack of urgency when there is a level of comfort granted people with more than enough resources to be able to pursue their creative interests, pursuits, and like how hard that is. I am speaking from experience. I resonate with Laurie 100%. That's why I'm projecting all of my shit onto him. All right, so moving on to Mr. Laurence. It is interesting and worth noting that Mr. Laurence seems very excited at the possibility of Beth coming to play his piano. In the terms of contact nutrition from episode 2, we see that there's this shared rhythm of music in his home, and it even reminds him of his daughter. And again, he's kind of shunning music from Laurie's life. I don't really know how this makes Laurie feel. I imagine it's not great. Just like Sally is severed from an intimate relationship with Meg, clearly Mr. Laurence and Laurie have a similar severance, as I also mentioned in Laurie's, wanting to please his grandfather, yet really wanting to do what it is that he wants with his life. Not wanting to do the business. But what I really want to, even though there's, again, I could probably take an entire episode with Mr. Laurence, I really like to watch that transformation of Mr. Laurence in this, like, I'm a nice guy. I'm going to invite Beth to play my piano. Which seems to me it's a charity act. Especially when he adds that, like, oh, nobody's around. It's not going to bother anyone. So put another way, it's like, oh, I can give you this thing because it doesn't really impact me at all to do so. And I can feel good while I do it. We see Mr. Laurence walk down that staircase and sit on the stairs listening to Beth play. And she makes him slippers as a thank you. And then he gives her a piano. And then we see, like, after she dies, he's so devastated. He's too devastated to be able to go into her home after she dies, because being in that home without her there might just be too much for him to handle. So we see this development of their relationship that at the beginning there was this level of charity, right? I want to kind of like, I'm going to give to you in a way that like isn't going to really impact me. It's like, I want to be one of the good ones. And he enters into a relationship of reciprocity. He's actually gaining attachment with her, building attachment, finding that she is actually helping him, connecting to his daughter, having some companionship and contact nutrition that he doesn't actually seem able to cultivate with his own grandson. And this feels just similar, reminiscent of the movement for a free Palestine. Palestine will free us. That the ways in which being in solidarity with those in down power positions will liberate us. But first we have to see our shared humanity, be in relationship with one another, be self-aware enough to be like, what are my motives? Am I doing this to be one of the good ones, or because I know that like it is the right thing to do? I am so clear on who I am and what my values are that like there's no way that I could not do this. And it makes me think of the Lila Watson quote, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." That at some point, Mr. Laurence is able to find some shred of connection, attachment with this little girl. That he's no longer like this hierarchical charity to, and he is in reciprocity with her. All right, so then when we get to Aunt March, she is demonstrating a severance from your own values. And with Aunt March, we see a scene with her in the carriage with Amy in the very, very beginning of the movie. And she makes some joke about the French. Amy doesn't hear her, so then she repeats it so that Amy can hear her. And then Amy chuckles. And then Aunt March says, "Don't humor me, girl." So I'm going to just paint with broad brush strokes here and remind you that there is a whole course on secure attachment on the Numinous Network with Carmen. But that this is a level of come here, go away behavior that points to a disorganized attachment field. So it's kind of like I might have to just get to this in a different episode because I haven't even talked about the types of attachment. But there's secure, anxious, avoidant, and disorganized, which is kind of like a combination platter of the anxious and avoidant. So Aunt March is kind of the ultimate disorganized attachment that we kind of see presented to us. The ultimate insecure attachment, I should say. She wants to have companionship. We see that she is literally paying her nieces to be her companion. And to me, it doesn't feel like it's kind of like a reciprocity of like, oh, it's the right thing to do. I have this money. It feels like it feels transactional. It doesn't feel relational. We also see that Aunt March seems to resent Amy for being her companion with this like, don't humor me, right? Like, I need you to laugh, but no, not like that. And also, I just want to like say that like jokes about a whole group of people, especially the people whose country that she is in, they're in Paris at this time, I believe. It is poor taste, if we're being generous, to be making jokes at an expense of one, you know, like, right, stereotypical jokes like that are just creating this like us versus them mentality that in this case is like indicative of people with the power in systems of domination and oppression. And in this case, it's her wealth. And when we have this us versus them in systems of capitalism and people who have access to hoarding wealth, there's an acknowledgement that like there's a small circle of us to whom my money will support, and then everybody else is them. And those people I maybe can support in a limited level or in a really controlled way, right? I will give you this money, but actually only if you use it in this way. So it's absolutely not reciprocity. Not even charity. It is actually like further exerting power over, like under the guise of being charitable, and a far cry from being relational or reciprocal. And you can tell that the Hadestown episode is coming up here because, and I will speak more about Hadestown in the next episode, but Aunt March is Hades. She is disconnected from the love of her family because she is gripping hard to her hoarded resources that, in my beliefs, she was hoarding because of her lack of attachment, her lack of connection with those she loved. And this disconnection, I think she was born into a rich family. So like, I think comes before her time. She learned this disconnection as a kid. Like she was taught it. I don't know that it was necessarily like developed over time. Maybe it was pruned. I digress. We don't really know. She's so closed off that she won't even shake Mr. Lawrence's hand at Meg's wedding. And it's such a small scene, but I saw it and it really cut deep, because that scene actually reminded me of when I went to a wedding with my own grandmother, and we were in the company of people who, I don't know, maybe my grandma would have described them as like rough around the edges, which I think is like they had like maybe a couple too many drinks, probably some plant medicine, and they were like really outgoing, really gracious to be like meeting my grandma. But she had like I just remember being struck by her cold detachment, kind of like reminiscent of like Queen Elizabeth or something, that I'm sure she was probably taught was like dignified. I remember at the time being like my impression being like, my grandma seems to think she's the Queen of England right now, with just the way that she was kind of interacting with these people. And I had like totally forgotten that was a memory that I had until I watched this episode and I saw this moment of Mr. Laurence. I'm like, Mr. Laurence he's like a rich dude. So like for her to like not want to shake his hand is like, it's not even like he's a lower class guy. It is like just so disconnected. So like, I don't know, like any sort of safe touch or, and whatever, like by all means, like a woman is allowed to deny a man touching her. So 100%, like it could be that. But I don't know. We're seeing a cluster of behavior from this woman. Anyway, okay. So Aunt March is afraid for her nieces because she is no stranger to how hard it is for women in heteropatriarchal capitalism. And she tries to exert her will onto Joe, who she says becomes a lost cause. And then she seems that she's actually able to influence Amy until Amy ultimately refuses Fred's offer of marriage because she is one of her mother's daughters and will not marry somebody who she doesn't feel she loves as she should. Anyway, it isn't clear in the movie when exactly Aunt March dies in relation to Amy marrying Laurie, and we don't know exactly when she drafted her will, but I just want to take a second here to remember and consider why she leaves her house to Joe. we see that she was so alone in her big house. She maybe didn't even realize it. She was so disconnected. We see in earlier conversations she had with Joe that she was proud of how she held on to her money so that it will last, unlike Joe's father. She tells Joe that it's foolish to put your money towards your values, and Joe openly disagrees and debates with her about it. In the book, I read that Joe and Aunt March seem to actually like have kind of a friend, like a really like kind of banterful friendship. That even though they're like opposites in perhaps worldviews, they're actually similar in the fact that they're so opinionated and not afraid to say so. So then, like, why would she leave her house to Joe? She's so proud of like holding on to her money. Why would she give her house to a person that she knows like, is so on the other side, like openly disagreed with her on like how to steward her money? So is it a one last ditch effort to use her money to control the March nieces? And I'm going to say it like, fuck no, because we can see that Joe was the least controllable niece. She said to Amy that Joe is a lost cause. So like, yeah, not buying that. Does she leave her house to Joe because she's compassionate and worried that Joe would be destitute and need the money? And if so, that was like very kind of her. And also, she knew that Joe was not going to hoard it because of all of their conversations. It is my belief that deep down, Aunt March knew that Joe was right. That deep down, her values were Joe's values, but all the conditioning of scarcity and hoarding that she was raised with kept her from being able to actually do it, to actually live out her values. That deep down, Aunt March knew that redistributing wealth is the right thing to do. And in Joe's case, what that looks like is opening up a school so that all kids could receive an education and to not be physically assaulted, like I'll get to in the next episode. Aunt March just simply did not have the somatic capacity to land safeness redistributing her wealth during her own lifetime. She knew that her desire was that her wealth would be more equitably distributed upon her death, and that Joe is the one that she trusted that task to the most. To reflect on the question of why Aunt March would do that is a poignant invitation. It is sad. It is beautiful. It took Aunt March dying to make it possible for her money to do what she knew was right all along. And I've alluded to it, but I want to officially take a moment to take an intimacy risk and admit where I locate myself in this story. As I said, I have enough access to wealth that I am able to make a hobby podcast in late stage capitalism instead of needing to sell my labor for currency. I get to live in a vacation destination while I do it. I can and probably will go into my personal story of wealth accumulation another day. But I can sum it up by saying that I was raised perceiving that poverty was a very real threat if we were not, quote unquote, responsible with our money. We shopped frugally, we clipped coupons, we sacrificed our wants, but we never went without anything we needed. And in hindsight, I can see that we were safely middle class in the golden age of middle class suburban white folks. I mentioned that I acquired wealth through tragedy as well as inheritance, and that money is energy. That when we are taught to grasp and hoard money, it is a trauma response. And so when I locate myself in this story, I resonate more than I maybe would like to with Aunt March. There are parts of me that were celebrated for being a good saver, for living within my means. There's a part of me that feels proud that I saved up enough to be able to create this podcast during a sabbatical on these Chorotega lands. And I really identify with Laurie. Like I said, I'm someone with access to wealth who deeply wants to create and is carrying this burden of just perceived family disapproval. 3 years resisting my desire to just actually press record and make the Ding Dang podcast, to integrate what I have learned. It has been and continues to feel so scary, so vulnerable, so confusing. What does it look like to create content outside the confines of capitalism? When you've only been taught to value that which produces value in capitalism, which is a wealth wound, which is exploitation and extraction of people and resources, then I'm cutting myself off from my desire to create and integrate my learning and sharing it out. And yet, the times when I've been able to vulnerably peek out and speak the hard truths from the places where I hurt and where I've been met with love and compassion, the only thing that made it possible for my body to be able to entertain the possibility of divesting and releasing my wealth in a way that would land safeness, like it's the right thing to do, as opposed to a move to innocence. This podcast is it. I wonder what would happen if more people questioned what is enough. I did a course, a cohort with Toy Smith. I will link her in the show notes, but it was called The Responsibility of White Wealth. And she talks a lot about what is your enough number? Like, how much money do you actually need? When will it be enough? How do you know? I mean, capitalism doesn't teach us to ask ourselves that question. It is assumed that we always need more. I have to work until I get to a certain age, because our identity is so bound up in how we sell our labor for currency. But how different would the world be if more people could recognize the privileges that they hold in capitalism? To ask the question of, do I need to be saving all this money for future generations, legacy inheritances and trust funds? And when there's very real, alive needs in my community, and not giving from a sense of shame that like, oh, I have so much more, but like, because I'm actually connected to my community, that I see that it's the right thing to do. That if we live more communally now, there won't be the need for future generations to have the hoarded wealth of this generation. My invitation is to anybody who is able to take a sabbatical and unwind from lies of you don't have enough money. And this is, again, a fucking nuanced conversation that I recognize very niche. If you're listening to this, statistically speaking, this is not you. And also, for years, I didn't think that this was me either. But I was like, could I quit my job for a little while and ask the questions that I am posing in this podcast series? Though they are some fucking hard questions to swallow. So maybe I might need some plant medicine to help me with that. maybe I need to consider what it would be like to embody a new sense of myself in a new community. Did it involve a dramatic haircut and a bunch of new tattoos and moving to Costa Rica? Yeah, I think it kind of did. How would the world be different if every millionaire could just take 2 years to just follow their delight in asking hard questions? Like, what is enough? What are my motives? Whose land am I on? What does it take for me to be here in a good way? How can I lean into my community more and believe in my hyper individuality just a little bit less? What do I need in order to live in alignment with my values? I'm working towards becoming Marmee. We know that she was born into a wealthy family, but she was so deep in her convictions, and she divested her wealth because she expanded her sense of community. We see such a clear delineation of these classes. We see that she's connected with the Hummels, which is a class lower than theirs, and maintains some relationship with Mr. Laurence. Like, she has people above that she can lean on, people below, in terms of this like capitalist hierarchical like access to wealth. She has people with access to more and people with access to less, and she is teaching her girls that it's the right thing to do. When there's somebody in your community that has no breakfast, no food on Christmas, you bring them your breakfast. And then that inspires Mr. Laurence to then give them a breakfast, which is like, yeah, a cutesy little parable in the story. And yet, I believe it's true. When you let the energy of money and resources, if you can store your excess in the belly of your neighbor, you are expanding your community. You are living in more and more communally. That's how it works. That's how it's supposed to work. That's the world that I'm reaching towards. That's who I want to be. That's every day from now until the day I die. I want to be one step closer to that. So I will just leave with the question of, and I will ask this myself, what have I had to lose in myself in order to gain within capitalist systems? And if I can release what it is that I have gained in capitalism, what parts of myself can I reclaim? What future becomes possible? What is needed to get there? And what is my role? What is my positionality? Thank you so much for tuning in to episode 4. I want to thank, of course, Carmen Spaniola and her teachings on the Numinous Network. I would also like to thank Toy Smith. Her work is in the show notes as well. I can't recommend highly enough the Responsibility of White Wealth cohort that she led. She also has an amazing newsletter you can sign up for. Her Instagram's amazing. Can't recommend her highly enough if these questions resonated with you. Next episode is going to be invitations to liberation, cracks in the wall, Hadestown vibes. Don't miss it. And I want to thank Matt Shuby for the podcast art, my husband Kevin Carlo for all his help in the creation of the theme song for the podcast, and Anais Mitchell and John Williams for their inspiration of Hedwig's theme and Hadestown. And before I sign off, I would like to leave you with a quote from another one of my teachers, Rev. Angel Kyoto Williams, who says, "Love and justice are not two. Without inner change, there can be no outer change. And without collective change, no change matters."